All right, so joining us this morning to weigh in on some of those issues highlighted in those reports, Mr. Bayo Oluwake, an international affairs analyst. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on the program today.
Good morning, Chamberlain. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so tell us first, let's get your general impression about the handling of this matter between Nigeria and this Chinese company with the French court's decision. Now, when you say Nigeria, many thought, whoa, how did Nigeria even come into this in the first place? It's supposed to be Ogun State, but from what we've seen, it's just been going back and forth. Nigeria now say they're working with Ogun State to see how they can ensure that things are set right. In terms of how this has been handled, what do you make of it?
Well, when I heard the news, I was a little bit surprised. Then of course, I saw the statements of the federal government, which clearly highlighted the fact that this was some sort of a dispute between the Chinese company and the government of Ogun State. But then the Chinese, as is now in the public domain, have instituted proceedings against the Federal Republic of Nigeria and France, which led to the seizure of some federal assets, mainly some of the presidential aircraft. I think, first of all, the issue of dispute between a subnational state in Nigeria and then international entity will invariably involve the federal government, because in international law, especially when it comes to international arbitration, it will be the government of Nigeria that will be the first, if you like, respondent, because internationally, Nigeria is the one that plays within that arena. Subnationals don't play in the international arena. Only the federal government, for instance, has a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The states don't have ministries of foreign affairs. And should it be a question of a loan, in this case, it is not a loan, but I'm just using this as an example. Should it be the question of a subnational in Nigeria, say any of the states, obtaining a loan from an international entity, that loan will have to be guaranteed by the federal government. Because like I said, only the federal entity plays in the international arena. So to this extent, one will understand why the federal government has been taken to court. And I think the explanation of the federal government is also alludes to this. And then it also highlights the fact that it is engaging with the Ogun State government to try to resolve the matter. I was hoping that this would not get to this level. The exact details of how we arrived here are not public, even though the statement of the federal government gave some decent background information. And so I feel that the federal government would have to deal with this matter, internationally, especially to get those assets that have been frozen to be released. One worrisome fact, though, is that it would appear, going by the information that the federal government has put in the public domain, that the Chinese entity is trying to profit from some sort of a loophole and reap where it did not sow. So to speak. But then we will need to hear from the Chinese perspective and then see how the matter will be resolved. The fact that the Chinese had tried to institute proceedings against the federal government in the United States and the United Kingdom and had not been so successful might be something of a consolation that perhaps this case instituted in France might go the Nigerian way. But the advice one would give should be that the best legal minds in Nigeria should be contracted, and if possible internationally as well, because it's a French court, to try to make sure that the matter is resolved. It's quite embarrassing, that Nigeria will find itself in such a litigious circumstance. But let's hope that they can sort it out and the reputation of the country can be regained.
One of the other item that came up there for a number of people is that it appears as though this Chinese company at least did some digging to the extent that jets that Nigerians some don't know that the government had acquired. They listed it as part of the property that should be acquired, should be seized from Nigeria to handed to this Chinese company. In that regard, were you surprised when that information came through? Because many thought, wait a minute, the government hadn't told us that they've acquired this jet, so where is this coming from? Did you hear that, Mr. Lowake?
No, Chamberlain, I lost you.
Okay,
you're saying something about the property of the Chinese company.
No, I'm talking about the way they might have done their digging. We don't know if they had information from their other agencies, Chinese companies or something here, because they even cited the certain jet owned by Nigeria, newly acquired jet, which several Nigerians are still wondering, wait a minute, did they acquire this jet and were not even publicly or officially told that they've acquired this jet? So when that information came through, how did you process it?
Yes, I was surprised because I saw the list of assets, which are mainly the presidential fleet. And I saw an Airbus. And I know that in our presidential fleet, we don't have an Airbus. We have a 727, we have a Gulfstream, we have a Falcon, but we've never operated an Airbus in the presidential fleet. So it points to the fact, I assume perhaps this is the new aircraft that the federal government is trying to acquire. But it's quite surprising that even that is part of what has been seized. So the question, of course, would be, have we fully paid and have we taken delivery of that aircraft for it now to be part of what has been seized? And how did they know that these aircraft were undergoing, the normal checks, not security, but now maintenance checks in France? So they had very good information. Which might point to some Nigerians as well colluding with them, and which is worrisome, and I think this is what the federal government will need to investigate.
Well, we've heard the response of the Attorney General, saying that those assets are sovereign assets and they're immune from any seizure by, will I say, another foreign entity, as the case might be. Can you speak a little more on what constitutes sovereign assets and perhaps any, let's say, guiding international relations principle around them?
Yeah, I think that's quite a good argument by the federal government. Now, but a couple of questions would arise, surrounding that. If we have an embassy, say in France, our embassy in France and all assets belonging to our embassy in France are sovereign assets, and they will be covered by the relevant provisions of the Vienna Convention, the Vienna Diplomatic Convention, and so on and so forth. Now, when an aircraft is flown into a country to undergo maintenance, I think perhaps we might need very good lawyers to show that these are sovereign assets. I'm not exactly clear, given the circumstances in which those aircraft arrived in France. If, for instance, our president or any of our top official was visiting France, all the diplomatic immunities and privileges, will accrue automatically, including, of course, the vessels by which they have accessed that particular country. But when these aircraft are sent for maintenance, I do not know the circumstances. Is it a vendor who took those aircraft to France? Was the maintenance contracted to that vendor? What were the circumstances by which that vendor moved the aircraft? And what are the procedures, and documentation that that vendor had followed in bringing those aircraft into France? So these are some of the questions that may have to determine, whether these are actually sovereign assets as at the time that they were seized. And one not being privy to such information, I think it will be difficult to advance arguments. I want to assume that the federal government, of course, has more information with regard to this, and therefore is making such a position.
What level of disclosure would you say that the federal government of Nigeria owes its citizens with regards to this particular matter?
That's a very good question. I would single out the issue of the Airbus, which is part of the aircraft allegedly seized now. Except I missed it, but I'm not aware that this has been disclosed as having been fully acquired and inducted into the presidential fleet. So is this aircraft still with the manufacturer? Because Airbus Industrie is a French company and the factory is in France. So is that aircraft still with the manufacturer, or has that aircraft actually been delivered officially to the Nigerian government? I think this would be some of the questions, but then the federal authorities, I believe, ought to have informed the country, because now we just learned that this is one of the aircraft seized. But again, I'm saying I may be wrong, but I have not seen previously any public information to the effect that that aircraft had actually been inducted and delivered to Nigeria. Perhaps it was done and it was not publicized, but this was not public knowledge. Again, on this, I stand to be corrected. Now, if this were the case, then I think there's a lesson to be learned going forward in how and when such information are made public, especially to clarify things to such unwarranted situations as we have found ourselves should occur again.
Well, my interest is in the visit of Mr. President to Malabo, and which conversation surrounded the signing of an agreement on gas pipeline for the Gulf of Guinea. Well, this is not the first of this series we are hearing, and quite a number have gone on. What would be your understanding of this? There are a number of people in Nigeria will probably say, is that what's next? What's your take on it? What's your understanding of this, and what hopes does it bring for Nigeria?
First of all, I think it's a very good initiative by the president. I think that right now the country is under a lot of pressure to generate additional foreign exchange. And I think that such an initiative as this gives us a vantage position from which to try to generate additional foreign exchange, especially in contexts where they do not have histories of pipeline vandalization and some of the indiscipline and misdemeanors that have plagued our own domestic economy. So the more we are able to invest in such offshore, environments, I think the better for our economy. So I commend the president and his team for this effort. Now, what I think the president needs to watch out for in order for this kind of initiative to actually live up to its billing is to look at our history. We do not have a history of executing or delivering such initiatives perfectly. And I'll cite one or two examples. We signed an agreement with Sao Tome and Principe in 2001 to set up a joint development zone, JDZ, in the Gulf of Guinea in waters that are territorial to Sao Tome and Principe. And then we established the Nigeria-Sao Tome Joint Development Zone in the year 2002. It effectively took off. But as you and I speak or have this conversation, we do not have any information in the public domain as to how successful this initiative has been. We haven't seen the attainment of milestones. We haven't seen the outcome of those initiatives. And Nigeria, if I recall correctly, was supposed to finance the exploration of oil within the JDZ to, I think, a tune of between 60 or 70% for those allocated under the JDZ. So Mr. President should need to go back in history and ask to know exactly where we are with that project. Because if we are not moving forward with that project, what is there to suggest that we can move forward with this initiative that the president has initiated with Equatorial Guinea? Secondly, we have some countries in Africa that have delivered on similar enterprises successfully. And I'll cite Libya under Colonel Gaddafi. Under Colonel Gaddafi, Libya acquired 7% of the Italian vehicle company known as Iveco. Libya acquired several assets in Uganda. Libya acquired most of the tourism assets, perhaps the blue chip tourism assets in Kenya. They were owned by the state of Libya. I don't know what the current situation with those assets are, but these are examples to show that even if Libya had stopped pumping oil, Libya was already getting to a stage where it was having substantial investments in many offshore assets that was sufficient enough to significantly drive its economy should anything happen to the oil industry. So when we went into the JDZ, it was a pointer to the fact that we are now beginning to do something good, just as the Libyans did. The second example I'll quickly cite is the West African gas pipeline. I'm sure you recall that not too long ago, Ghana, Togo, and a few countries began to suffer blackouts based on the inability of Nigeria to supply gas. So Mr. President needs to also investigate this, because when we have all of these offshore assets and we are not delivering effectively on them, there's a risk that this laudable initiative that the president has initiated with Equatorial Guinea may also go the same way. One good point I would like to add before I wrap up on this is that for many Nigerians who may not know, Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea are extremely close. In fact, in the 80s, and I say in the 80s because I'm not current, I don't know what the demographic reality is today, but in the 80s, the Nigerian population in Equatorial Guinea was more than the population of the citizens of Equatorial Guinea. And this dates back to the practice of the Spanish colonial power that created dysfunctions within the Equatorial Guinean society such that they could not have labor to work on the cocoa plantations. And they had to resort to hiring labor from Nigeria, specifically from Akwa Ibom and Cross River states. So, and I suspect the reality is probably still the same. We have more Nigerians in Equatorial Guinea than the population of Equatorial Guinea. So this initiative of Mr. President is not only something that could benefit the homeland Nigeria, but that also has potential benefit for our Nigerian citizens who are relatively the majority in Equatorial Guinea. So for these and other reasons, I think the president needs to make sure that this works. Maybe by setting up a special purpose vehicle, because I feel that all these initiatives that we do offshore do not have any special purpose vehicle to drive them. They are either being run partly by Ministry of Foreign Affairs, partly by the presidency, partly by the NNPC, partly by Ministry of Petroleum or whatever. But I think we need to come to a stage now where there should be a special purpose vehicle, and I dare say something perhaps in the mold of a Nigerian Agency for International Development. And this Nigerian Agency for International Development should warehouse all of these projects that can enhance the soft power of Nigeria in the international domain and ensure that we can run them successfully and their objectives can be met for the benefit of our citizens.
Well, just one more thing, and this has to do with security. You know, the president, who happens to be the chairman of ECOWAS, who was appointed, he's speaking about a standby force, at least for the sub-region, such that we'll be able to address terrorism. He spoke of a similar scenario when he attended the AU summit. But at what point, how do you see this playing out, for instance? I mean, when you talk about ECOWAS, even ECOWAS countries, you know the role Nigeria has got to play. So if he's trying to rally the troops, is it a right strategy, a right time? Do you see this even happening? Can we afford it at this point in time?
Good question, Chamberlain. I respectfully would like to suggest that we avail ourselves of the resources available in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't know if the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is part of those who wrote that speech for the president. We have an ECOWAS standby force already. We have a multinational joint task force comprising of the Lake Chad countries, Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, battling Boko Haram and ISWAP. So in my own opinion, maybe the president has something else in mind, but in my own opinion, we need to just rely on the ECOWAS standby force, which already exists. I really don't think we need any new force to combat terrorism, because part of the remit of the ECOWAS standby force is also to fight terrorism. And we have examples. We deployed troops to Mali under AFISMA at the beginning of the operations to fight against the Tuaregs who were threatening the government of Captain Sanogo. Okay? And we have deployed troops around, either as part of ECOWAS or bilaterally, or as part of the multinational joint task force, unless if what the president is hinting at is something specific to terrorism alone. But then they probably have some information maybe not available to us. But in my humble opinion, I would rather say that Mr. President could actually look at making the ECOWAS standby force to be fit for purpose regarding this idea that he's pushing, or to see how they can retweak the multinational joint task force. I think this would be better than trying to set up something new that will require a different infrastructure at a time they were struggling to get our economy going. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Bayo Oloake. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.